All right, so today we are going to talk about the major domains and kingdoms that we referenced in the last lesson, and then we're going to talk about cladograms specifically, or like phylogenetic trees, which is what I was talking about last lecture, that I was like, hey, don't worry about it until later. So make sure you have done your attendance and your contact tracing first, and we'll get into this. So the objective is that students will be able to list distinguishing characteristics of major classes in the animal and plant kingdoms using phylogenetic trees. So the do now is using the scientific names of the 4 following amphibians, which 2 are the closest related and how do you know? And I put a list of amphibians, and amphibians are the organisms that when they're babies, they live in the water and they breathe through gills and they breathe in the water. And then when they are growing up into adults, they transition to air breathing and breathing on land. So we have the common toad, which is Bufo bufo. We have common frog, which is Rana temporaria. We have the marsh frog, which is Pelophylax ridibundus. Then we have the American toad, which is Bufo americanus. Okay, so you tell me which 2 are the closest related based on their scientific name, and how do you know? Right? The answer is going to be that the common toad and the American toad are the most closely related, because even though their species name, their second name, is different, Bufo versus americanus, their genus name is the same, which is both Bufo. Okay. So here's some essential vocabulary. If you have a notebook, I would love it if you could write these down, like pause and write these down so that you can reference them if you don't already know them. So prokaryotic means that the cells in the organisms do not have nuclei, which means that DNA is just kind of floating around inside the cell. Eukaryotic, on the other hand, means that cells do have nuclei. So the DNA is covered by a membrane and it's in a specific area in the center of the cell. Unicellular means that organisms only have one cell. And so this whole cell is that whole organism, which means it's probably pretty tiny. Multicellular means that the organism is made up of more than one cell, right? Multi means many, uni means one. Autotrophic, remember, is like plants, right? It's an organism that is capable of making its own food. So it doesn't need anybody else to support it. It makes its own food. And then heterotroph means that it's an organism that must consume food, or it gets food from another source, usually by eating another heterotroph or by eating an autotroph. So there are 3 domains of life. The 3 main domains are Archaea, bacteria, and Eukarya. So all of the kingdoms fall under the 3 domains. Okay, so in the triangle pyramid that I showed in the last lecture, domain goes right above. So domain is like all living things, and then the kingdoms are part of, we'll mostly talk about Eukarya as having kingdoms. So first off, we have Archaea as one of the domains. And Archaea are prokaryotic, which means that they do not have nuclei. They are unicellular, which means they're small and microscopic. They are autotrophic and heterotrophic, because some of them can make their own food and some of them can't. They are found in extreme environments. So any environment that you think that you cannot possibly survive in, that's where they're found. They're not found in normal places where like we can survive, right? If you have like a temperature between like 0 and 100, they can't live there. It's too normal. They have to live in something that's way below freezing or way below boiling water, right? They live in places that there's no oxygen. They live in places where there's no sunlight, right? So an example is like methanogens, which live in swamps and marshes where there's no oxygen, right? They use methane, which is a kind of combustible gas, and it's toxic if you breathe a lot of it, but they love it, right? Honestly, Archaea are kind of strange, because if you put them from their normal environment, which is extreme for any other living organism, and you put it into a normal environment, it will actually kill them. Okay, so you find Archaea also at the bottom of the ocean, living next to boiling vents close to the Earth's crust, and where there's no oxygen and no sunlight, but they thrive there, right? You'll find other Archaea frozen in glaciers in Antarctica, because they live where the temperature is unlivable for most other things. So that's Archaea. The thing is, you want to remember that they're extreme. The other domain is bacteria. So bacteria are also prokaryotic, which means that they don't have nuclei. They are unicellular, which means they're also microscopic. So you can only see them when you're like using a microscope. Some of them are autotrophic and some of them are heterotrophic, and they live everywhere that we would live, like in normal environments, right? That's why bacteria tend to infect us and like organisms that live in normal environments, because they also live in the same area. Okay, examples are like E. coli, which is found in your intestines and in poop, and streptococcus, which causes strep throat when you get sick. The third one is Eukarya, and Eukarya has 4 main kingdoms, so we'll get into that after this. So Eukarya obviously are named after being eukaryotic, or eukaryotes, which means that their cells have a nucleus, which means their DNA is contained. Some eukaryotes are unicellular and some of them are multicellular. And then obviously some are autotrophic and some are heterotrophic, and they live everywhere in normal environments as well. Examples would be humans, fish, trees, bugs, right? In pictures over here, we have mushrooms, we have plants, we have a bear, right? Those are all eukaryotes. So within eukaryotes, we have four main kingdoms here. We have Protista. Protista are eukaryotic. They're mostly unicellular, so they're hard to see with the naked eye. Some of them are autotrophic, right? Over here, we have a picture of a blue-green one, which means that it does photosynthesis. And then we have ones that don't do photosynthesis that don't have that coloration, right? They're like a neutral color. We have a very diverse group here with protists. So basically anything that didn't fit in the other kingdoms, scientists were like, we're just gonna put them in the same group. They're kind of like the leftover group here because they couldn't be placed anywhere else. So scientists were like, we're just gonna make another group and then put everybody else who doesn't fit into the other ones in here. So an example is an amoeba. And here's a picture of an amoeba. An amoeba are really cool because they can grow little arms and stretch them out and then envelop their food and then drag them in. And you can see the food literally struggling to escape while it's under a microscope. And you'll see them slowly die and get digested by the amoeba. So, and then there's other ones here that are green that all have their own chlorophyll and do photosynthesis. Some of them have tails that help them swim. Some of them have little cilia or little hairs around that pedal like really, really fast that help them swim as well. So Protista are very interesting, but they're also very, very small. The second kingdom that we're going to talk about is the fungi kingdom. And fungi are mushrooms. Okay, so mushrooms or fungi are eukaryotic and they're mostly multicellular. They are heterotrophic because they do not make their own food. They digest things that are decaying or dead. So they're decomposers. Their cell wall is made out of chitin. Okay, so they have cell walls, but it's not the same thing that like we eat as plant fiber for plants, right? We don't get the same thing for their cell walls as we do in plants. And like I said already, the examples are mushrooms or mold. Those are all fungi. The third kingdom is Plantae or plants, right? Plants are eukaryotic. They're multicellular. They are autotrophic because they make their own food from using light energy. And that's through the process of photosynthesis. And then an example would be like a sunflower or a daffodil or grass or trees. And then the kingdom of Animalia is obviously for animals, right? Animals are eukaryotic, they're multicellular. They're heterotrophic because they don't make their own food. They do not have cell walls. That's the biggest difference too in the cellular structure between animals and plants. And then examples are like elephants, tigers, butterflies, humans, monkeys, dogs. There's plenty of examples that we know better than maybe some of the other groups just because we encounter them more often. So let me talk about cladograms or phylogenetic trees. So the word that we commonly use for phylogenetic trees is cladograms. Gram meaning diagram and clado being the different groups, right? Clades are groups. Phylogenetic trees are cladograms. They show the phylogenetic or genetic and grouped relationships in a tree format of different species and how they're related to each other and where they evolved from and throughout time who came first. Okay, so cladograms and phylograms show the evolutionary relationship between organisms, and I'm going to show you or kind of demonstrate at least how to read it. So how do you read a cladogram? So the way this works is that at the bottom or the furthest back references the longest time ago in this tree. And so as you're going from the bottom to the front, time is moving from long ago until now. So the species shown in the tree are generally going to be species that exist now. And just even looking at them or having known what they are, you already know that they're different. So a long time ago, there were different traits evolving that caused speciation. And these traits are marked inside of the cladogram. And they show you when the traits evolved, when the species became different from their common ancestor, and what led to us being different from other species that currently exist. So you always start from long time ago. So sometime in history, the character trait of having a backbone or a spinal cord evolved. And out of that trait, there were a bunch of species that currently now have spinal cords, okay? So we have the fish species that exist now, and they exist and currently exist, and their ancestor existed back here after the backbone developed. But when the lungs trait developed, these fish did not develop that trait. So that's why this trait is after them on the tree. Okay, so you see that fish branched off here, and then going along the time, lungs developed. Okay, so we have salamanders, right? We know that salamanders are amphibians, so their babies still breathe in the water, but when they're adults, they grow lungs, so they now breathe air, so they have lungs, right? And then salamanders are these squishy, soft, rounded little organisms, and somewhere along history, if you keep following the cladogram tree, the trait of having claws or nails developed. So salamanders branched off before then because they don't have claws or nails. And then sometimes, at some point, lizards developed as a species, right? And then they branched off because the next trait that developed in history was having fur or having mammary glands. Basically, mammals started existing. And so the lizards branched off before that because they don't have fur and they don't have mammary glands. And at some point, these smaller organisms that have fur and mammary glands were like the mouse, and they branched off, okay? Or their ancestor branched off. And then a long time ago, as we go closer to recent time though, the opposable thumb, like we have, developed. And so the species that branched off of that had a common ancestor that led to eventually developing into the chimpanzee and developing into the human, right? These are all current species, but you see that their ancestors branched off at certain times, whether it was a long time ago back here or more recently, to what we have now. And you can see the traits that if you go back in time, they were developing slowly to become more complex traits, right? So the backbone developed here, which means that everything after it has a backbone, right? Fish, salamanders, lizards, mice, chimpanzees, and humans all have backbones, right? But the fur and the mammary glands developed up here. So you know that anything to the left or behind that branched off does not have fur or mammary glands. So like the lizard, the salamander, and the fish don't have fur or mammary glands because they are to the left side of this trait, okay? So we're gonna do some practice now. We're gonna look at the same tree. Which two organisms are the least related or are the furthest away and have the most trait differences? The answer would be if you wanted to compare the fish and the chimp or the fish and the humans, right? Because both the fish, and, the chimpanzee and the humans have no differences between them. So you can compare either of them. They're the same evolutionary branch. But the fish and the chimps or humans have 1, 2, 3, 4 differences between them in traits. So you know that they're very distantly related because there's so many differences. The only similarities that humans and chimps have with fish are that there is a backbone. That's it. Which two organisms are the most related? The answer would be the chimps and the humans, because do you see any trait differences here? Do you see any little tick marks that show a trait difference? No, because the last trait that develops between chimps and humans was the opposable thumb. So you know that humans and chimps have a very recent common ancestor, and they don't have that many differences because there's no major trait difference here marked on either here or on here. How many evolutionary stages separate chimps and salamanders? So you want to look for how many tick marks are between the chimps and the salamanders. The answer would be from the chimps, the salamanders, you see 1, opposable thumbs, 2, fur and mammary glands, and then 3, claws or nails. And then you see that the salamander has branched here. So you wouldn't include lungs and you wouldn't include backbone because the salamander is here and you go 1, 2, 3, and then chimps, right? These different traits are the stages of evolution. So 1, 2, 3. So the answer would be 3 for number 3. So you are going to go ahead and do your interactive notebook section. There's a huge section on the different kingdoms and their characteristics. And then you're going to finish up by doing your exit ticket.